On this episode of Maybe God, many know him as the pastor of one of America's most successful self-made women.
You baptized Beyonce.
Yeah.
You married Beyonce.
Mm-hmm.
And I guess she calls you friend.
Today, a rare and honest conversation with Pastor Rudy Rasmus on race in America.
The fear of the loss of control and power will make people do anything and say anything, including so-called Christians.
Is it harder than it's ever been to be black and Christian? And
Oh, yeah.
pastor?
Yeah.
That's saying a lot considering you grew up drinking from a colored water fountain.
Makes me cry.
I had a running tally in my head as this interview went on, how many listeners I'm losing just by having the conversation.
It's all coming up on episode 5 of Maybe God.
The real reason I wanted to sit down with you, Rudy, is you're Beyonce's pastor. And
Mm-hmm.
I want to know how I can meet Beyonce. That's the only reason you're here. You baptized Beyonce.
Yeah.
You married Beyonce.
Mm-hmm.
And I guess she calls you friend.
Yeah.
So tell me more about Beyonce.
You know, this is a funny thing. Having a pop icon grow up around you demystifies pop icons.
I imagine that's true, yeah.
Yeah. I like to point back to when I first knew she was going to do something big. She was about 8 years old, and I had never met a person more focused on their art as that 8-year-old. Sang and danced constantly.
So you knew then.
That work ethic, man. So she started singing in our choir when she was maybe 14, 15. The presence of potential stardom is a factor. And we hear about this factor all the time.
Yeah.
It's called it. And some people just have that factor.
Right.
She had that factor.
The first time I met Rudy Rasmus, I was new to Houston, and he called me up out of the blue to get a cup of coffee near downtown. I didn't know anything about him, and I wasn't sure why he even wanted to get together. I figured he had some kind of agenda, something he wanted or needed from me, and so as we sat there, sipping our Americanos, making small talk, I kept waiting for him to say, "The reason I asked you here," or "I wanted to connect with you because," but the pitch never came. What did come, however, was one Rudy Rasmus fan after another. 2 young black men stopped at our table and said, "Pastor Rudy, what's up?" And then a middle-aged white woman came by to thank him for something he said on his radio show. A teenager stopped and asked if she could take a selfie with him. By the time our meeting was over, 2 things were clear. First, I was drinking coffee with some kind of celebrity. And second, his only agenda was to welcome me to Houston and to tell me that God loves me. Since that time, Rudy and I have gotten to be really good friends. So I invited him to my house this week to talk about race and religion in America. He's a pastor in one of Houston's most diverse and economically challenged neighborhoods, while I lead a church in one of the city's widest and richest areas. It was one of the most honest, most raw conversations about race I've ever been a part of. I had no idea how much I needed this talk with Rudy. What I realized is that he isn't just from Houston. Rudy is Houston. Larger than life and full of love, but also fragile and fearful. That's Rudy. And that's Houston. Which makes sense, because it was life on this city's streets during the civil rights era that made him the man he is today.
I'm 61 years old now.
You look good, man. You look good.
You know, I'm feeling good, and I'm really grateful, too, because it could be very different. But I grew up in Houston, and this is really my town. But it's just something about this town that I just really love.
Where were you raised? What part of town?
I was raised in the center of Houston, in a neighborhood called the West End, and it just really reflecting on my childhood here. I lived in an extremely black world. Rarely encountered white folk. As a matter of fact, when I was a kid, I really didn't learn how to swim because Memorial Park only had certain days for coloreds, where the days before they would drain the pool after the colored day and refill it with water. And it was really weird.
For how many years did this go on?
So here's the straight. I drank from a separate water fountain in Houston, Texas until I was 12 years old. That water fountain was marked colored. I think when I look back at my angst with even the current scenarios in America, I feel a lot of that water fountain creeping back into the picture. And one of my major challenges with church was its inability to answer my questions as a kid about that separate water fountain. But I will tell you this, the Houston Zoo, an amazing place.
Even as a kid?
As a kid, yeah. In the middle of the Houston Zoo, there was a lion head fountain, a big fountain, ceramic fountain shaped like a lion. And I had my mom take me to that zoo as often as I could get her there for one reason, because I love to drink water from the lion head fountain. I really did.
Was everybody welcome to same?
That's why I liked it. When I got in line at that fountain, there were kids from every neighborhood, every hue, every race, every origin, who lined up with me to get a drink from that fountain. So I would go back to church on Sunday and I would say, damn, the zoo's got it worked out.
The zoo's got it worked out.
The zoo's got it worked out. But
we got to go to the zoo together so we can go see if it's still there and drink some water.
Let's do it. I need to do that. Yeah. But the people in and around the church seem to, first of all, never say anything about the atrocity of that separate fountain. So my question was always, if God is so powerful, why can't God eliminate that? And that was the one thing I wanted God to eliminate.
So you grew up in church and stayed in church even though you had these struggles.
I was dragged to church.
Okay.
I wasn't there by choice.
Who dragged you there?
My mama.
Okay.
Yeah, my mama was a church lady. She would go to church every Sunday. She would cry every Sunday. So when I was 12, I stopped and I never went back.
Did you ever find out why she was crying?
Yeah. My dad was a serial adulterer, and it created a lot of pain for my mom.
Do you believe in God at that point in your life?
No. Power has a way of expressing itself in the hood, and God just really didn't show up as a powerful force in the streets of Houston. We never really looked at the folk connected to faith as powerful people. Even the preachers back then, they were sharply dressed. They had nice cars. They were well respected, by the community. But they wasn't making change.
As a kid, Rudy didn't look forward to going to church, but he did love spending time at his Auntie Maymay's grocery store, Allen's Food Market.
That grocery store was, in my childhood opinion, more church than any church in that community. My Auntie Maymay was she was quite a lady. She was about 4 feet 6 inches tall. And in that grocery store, regardless of who walked through the door, the drunkest, stinkiest cat just in the streets could walk through the door. She would treat that person the same way she would treat the really dressed up guy who drove for the white people down the street.
Mm.
All right. I mean, there was no contrast.
How'd you experience the church differently from that?
The one thing I really appreciated about her was the way in which she embraced life. She was a real church lady. But she was married to a person who abused her the entire 50 years that they were married. And she always called this cat her darling dear. And I would say, man, come on, Maymay, why do you call him your darling dear when he shoots his deer rifles in the house in your direction to terrify you, hides mice in the freezer knowing that you are morbidly afraid of mice, and for many years beat her until one day I heard about it, and I told her if he ever touched her again, he wouldn't touch her again.
You told her that, or you told him that?
I told her that.
Okay.
Throughout all of that, she would couch her love for this person who did not treat her well on her love for Jesus and how Jesus really mandates for her to love. And I would say, I tell all the time, I say, now, if Jesus has mandated you to love someone like that, I don't want anything to do with Jesus. So she and we agreed to disagree. I loved her. She loved me.
But for someone, I mean, for Auntie Maymay, do you think that the love of Jesus was a cop-out, or do you think that she knew something you didn't about its power?
She knew something I didn't. And I'll tell you how she ultimately taught me this. I'm still, in these years, far from a relationship with Christ. But she had gotten diagnosed with cancer. And during those last almost 10 months, Juanita and I, my wife and I, moved in with her to take care of her. And during that time, she showed me how love without conditions really works. So she had an oxygen tank that she had to drag around the last probably 6 months of her life. And the bedroom Juanita and I slept in was right next door to her bedroom at her house. And one night Juanita started coughing and just couldn't stop coughing. And I'm half asleep. And all of a sudden I hear the wheels of my Auntie Maymay's oxygen tank rolling down the hardwood floor in the direction of our bedroom. Next thing I experience is my Auntie Maymay putting an additional quilt over Juanita and I. And I never forgot that.
What did that mean to you?
Well, in the midst of her own suffering, she was attuned enough to our needs that she was willing to get out of her bed, drag her oxygen tank down the hallway to make sure we were comfortable.
Wow. While I was preparing for this interview with my producers, I was shocked when I came across this story about Rudy's first job. When he was still just a kid, he helped his father run a motel in downtown Houston. And they rented most of their rooms out by the hour to pimps and prostitutes. Rudy continued working for this family business well into his 20s. I'm trying to picture this from the Rudy that I know and love, my friend. How did that come about, and what was that business?
First of all, that business was a modified whorehouse. That was my dad's dream. I called it, a borderline bordello because, it's more politically correct. But it was really a bad, nasty place. Mm-hmm. So when I was 5 years old, my dad brought a set of blueprints home. The blueprints were the actual design for a little motel that had only one purpose, and that purpose was to provide a place for sexual activity of all sorts.
Here in Houston?
Here in Houston. And my dad would always tell me, he said, he called me either Big Shot, Mr. President, or Boss Man. And this one, he'd say, Boss Man, what we're going to do is we're going to build this building, and we're going to profit from other people's pain.
Wow. Yeah. How old were you?
5. Yeah. Basically, he was preparing me to run a sexually oriented business. And part of the preparation was creating a different moral compass around sex. So sex for us and our family was always business. You can't be a customer and become profitable at the same time. So there was a great detachment around human sexuality and morality.
Yeah.
Yeah. So
were y'all running girls, or was it just the rooms?
Just the rooms.
Okay.
Yeah. We stayed out of the illegal side of that business. Other people did that. One thing I didn't really realize until I was much older is just how complicit I was in human trafficking in those days. And I've seen more than my share of really jacked up stuff. And over those years, it was the early years, my young adult years, I just, became really desensitized to violence. It was a very violent culture towards women.
Well, and you said you were profiting from people's pain. Mm-hmm. What? Whose pain?
Well, everyone who rented a room from us was renting it for one purpose. For early days, they were renting it to have sex. Ultimately, when the crack cocaine epidemic really hit, the rooms became used for both crack use and smoking. and sex. It was just a dark side of the universe, and I stayed on that dark side most of my young adult life.
What changed to get you out of the borderline bordello business?
Well, along the way, I go to a funeral one day, and at this funeral, I look over my shoulder, and a young woman entered the church. And when she comes through the door, there's this light around her. Now, for a guy who spent every waking hour in darkness, light can be pretty bright. So I see her, and I'm saying, wow. And it's, it wasn't necessarily a physical attraction. I was really attracted to who she was, or who could she be with a light that bright. In those days, she was selling life insurance. So I meet her, we're talking, and I'm trying to get a date. And at the same time, she was trying to get a life insurance appointment. So worked out pretty good. I got the date, she got the appointment. I bought the policy.
Of course you did.
Yeah, of course I did. and we dated for about 90 days.
You see, when I first met Rudy, I didn't have my mind made up about Rudy. I saw some things and I didn't like what I saw. And so we dated for about 90 days. And we went out on a wonderful dinner. He always took me to, and still does, takes me to great restaurants. And in that restaurant that evening, I said, I'm not going out with him anymore. Mimi, close your ears. I said, he's a male chauvinist pig, and I got things to do, and I'm going places. A year later, Rudy calls me and says, let's go have lunch. I said, sure. We ain't stopped having lunch since. Rudy made up his mind that he was gonna go with God even before he necessarily had a real sense of what God was doing in his life, for his life, through his life. And then what happened? God didn't just show up with a little something, he showed up with me. Come on, somebody.
Throughout my entire life, there's this inner voice that has always kept me safe. And throughout my whole life, this voice would always tell me the truth. The truth about people, truth about settings and situations, always tell me the truth. Well, I'm dating Juanita, and this voice tells me to not do anything that would cause her to not trust me, which was, in those days, virtually impossible. I'm not a very trustworthy guy. But I always honored the voice. And we went out to dinner one night, and I knew I wasn't going to be able to see her again. Because if I saw her any further, I was going to harm her. And I didn't want to harm her. Because remember, I was raised in a misogynistic culture. And that culture really had no good end for women. To honor the voice, that night was the last time I ever saw her. I never expected to see her again. And a year later, the voice really said, just, call Juanita. I called her, asked her out for lunch, and in a few months we were married. And
what changed during that year?
I think during that year I realized that Juanita probably had the brightest light I've ever seen in a human soul. And I wanted to be close to that light.
Now, does she know about the borderline bordello?
Yeah, when we married, she moved in with me and we lived there.
She was cool with it?
Well, she didn't fully know the depth of this organization. And I guess she did know that there was a little problem when her wedding gift was a gun. I think she knew there was a little problem.
Yeah. Red flag.
Red flag.
The newlyweds were still living at the motel when Juanita started taking Rudy to a church called Windsor Village, which was led by Reverend Kirby John Caldwell. Over the next 5 years, Rudy and Pastor Caldwell became close friends, even though Rudy continued to reject the Christian faith.
I kept running this business.
Yeah.
Kept profiting from people's pain, but I kept showing up in church. Now, we never talk about, are you a believer? Are you a member? Do you believe what I believe? None of that shit.
You're just friends.
Yeah, just friends.
Yeah.
And as friends, he gave me a chance to know a pastor that I could ultimately trust.
What was different about him from other pastors you had known?
Integrity. In my little borderline bordello, some of my best customers were pastors.
Really?
Oh yeah, man. Those guys really have problems.
Mm.
Yeah.
That's us, right?
That's right. And this guy, you know what he did for me? He gave me an opportunity to look up close at a pastor's life. And I will say, all of this stuff that he modeled for me, I did as a pastor. He drove an old car. I drove an old car. My first 24 years in ministry.
The pastors in your life growing up didn't drive old cars?
No, man, they drove new cars. They were shiny. Their lives were shiny. And it was part why nobody really trusted them. I mean, how do you profit from a poor neighborhood?
Right.
How are you the shiniest cat in the whole neighborhood?
Right.
Everybody else is suffering. So he had a decent place to live, but it wasn't the biggest house in the universe. And I think the one thing that really attracted me to him as a leader was his humility. When I knew he didn't have to be humble.
5 years into their friendship, Rudy became Kirby John's real estate broker. One day, the pastor asked Rudy to check out a property downtown as a potential spot for a new campus of Windsor Village.
He sent his staff down to look at it. And they all came back and said, man, nothing but homeless crack addicts around that place. The building is raggedy. It's on the dark end of downtown. This is a waste of time. When I got there, I got the keys. It's my first day looking at the building. And the building is surrounded by homeless crack addicts. And I drive up to the front and I started getting excited. And I called Juanita and I said, baby, this is the place.
Wow.
Yeah.
What was it about this location that set your heart on fire for the possibility of church there?
I think it was surrounded by homeless crack addicts.
The people your aunt
Yeah.
welcomed into the store.
So that year was the year I had become a Christian. And that same year, I had accepted a call to ministry. So I get to this place. I knew immediately that this was the place I was born to serve in. It's crazy.
That was 25 years ago. What happened next was really amazing. Rudy and Juanita were named as co-pastors of what became St. John's Methodist Church. Under their leadership, the church grew from 9 members to over 9,000 members. And now, every weekend, people from different backgrounds and living different lifestyles, people from every walk of life, share the same pews as they worship the same God together. St. John's is their home. Rudy and Juanita are their spiritual parents. Rudy has made it his life's mission to serve those he calls Houston's least, last, and lost. In 1992, he and Juanita founded Bread of Life, a ministry serving over 500 meals a day to homeless Houstonians in St. John's Sanctuary. Bread of Life also distributes over 9 tons of fresh produce to hungry families every single week. In 2006, Rudy led the establishment of the Knowles Timonos Apartments, a 43-unit residential development that was designed to provide permanent living accommodations for formerly homeless women and men in Houston. His biggest supporter in this initiative was none other than the Queen herself, Beyonce, and her family. They've given over $7 million to help make Rudy's dream a reality.
1, 2, 3, 4. Baby boy, you stay on my mind.
Beyonce's Super Bowl halftime show is still top 3 for me all time.
Yeah.
So you watched that one.
I watched that one.
What about last night? Today's day after,
I didn't watch
morning after Super Bowl 52.
I protested.
Eagles came out on top,
I'm glad they won
but you did not watch.
the game.
Why?
Well, I think NFL's leadership, I think there are days of owning people, treating people like chattel, assuming they have a fan base just because of the level of violence that is exemplified on the field, and marginalizing Kaepernick.
Kaepernick, that did it for you? That was the
It did it for me.
that was the line, the
Yeah.
red line. It does seem like he was Blackballed.
He was marginalized, no doubt about it.
Yeah.
So I'm taking a knee.
What would make it right for you?
I'm not really a sports guy. I'm a justice guy. So the only reason I have a connection to this conversation is because of a justice issue.
Yeah.
But I'm glad these guys make lots of money. But I think school teachers should make $30 million a year.
What would make it right, though, for the NFL and this kneeling and the anthem situation? I mean, that's what we're talking about here. I mean, that and many other issues.
To leave people alone. If they don't want to put their hand over their heart for the Pledge of Allegiance or the national anthem, they're grown men. They're free people. You know.
Is there an American flag in St. John's United Methodist Church?
Nah, that was the first thing we took out.
Do you pledge allegiance to the flag personally?
I don't pledge allegiance to anything and to any man, only to God. Matter of fact, that's the symbol on my ring. That's a Yoruban symbol, means no one but God.
Wow.
Yeah.
Seems like evangelical Christian voices are the ones leading the charge on this, like anti-Kaepernick charge, for example, and the get on your feet and put your hand on your heart and be good boys and be grateful for what this country has done for you. How do you deal with that? How do you reconcile that? You got one foot in either tribe, right? So you're in the Christian tribe, and you're also in the tribe of those taking a knee.
The fear of the loss of control and power will make people do anything and say anything, including so-called Christians. You know, at the end of the day, what we're really talking about is a challenge to the control the church has had over American politics, over American economy, even over the American ethos for many, many years. You know, but at the end of the day, what we have not been able to escape are our whack puritanical roots, that BS that came over on some ships in search of religious freedom, which ultimately became more religious oppression, you know. And I think one of my biggest challenges with Christianity over these years is its part in systemic oppression in and around the lives of people who, for the most part, were the profit incentive for the church for quite a few hundreds of years.
I talk a lot and work a lot with people that are just really skeptical and cynical about faith and things like that. And one of the things they say the most is that the Bible is a pro-slavery document, and that Christians have always been on the forefront of racism in America. How do you as a pastor respond to those kinds of things?
Well, first of all, I have to agree with them. And then I have to say that part of my work has been in reconciling those dark and even demonic aspects of Christianity. I'm going to tell you, Eric, as I look at the landscape, the church is really only experiencing a compensation for its part in the dark atrocities of racism in America. You know, the fact that young people are saying, well, maybe I'm going to sit this one out in terms of church is really because if those evangelicals who are so concerned about someone acknowledging an anthem, you know, that was penned in the midst of the slave trade, if they were equally concerned about the unmitigated incarceration of millions of black men, if they were equally concerned about the unexplained deaths of that same demographic, you know, at the hands of those who were sworn in to protect, if they were equally concerned about the American education system that is still separate and savagely unequal, if they were equally concerned about equality, you know, in every sense of the word, then maybe someone would give a damn whether or not their church has survived.
What do you say to those people that say there's also been a bunch of, you know, white Bible-toting evangelicals that held their Bibles and said slavery's wrong, segregation's wrong, and were part of these movements that changed the landscape?
The supremacy of white people, regardless on what side that person lines up on, at the end of the day, is still supremacy. You know, hell, if I was white, I'd probably be one of those Bible people who lined up on the side of black folk and said, yeah, but at the end of the day, at the end of the conversation, I know I could still put my Bible down, walk into the store, not be followed. I could still go to the bank, borrow some money. At the end of the day,
It's a different life.
it's a different life.
That's what I'm trying to wrap my head around constantly is I just listen, because, not everything you say I agree with on the surface.
Yeah.
And yet I know I just need to listen. And I feel like people are real slow to listen because it hurts. And we would rather say, well, black men are incarcerated because they broke the law, period. You know what I mean? Like,
Right.
It's easier to do that, man. And it's easier to say, yeah, some whites are racist, but a bunch of white Christians, look at Will Wilberforce. Go watch that movie and see what he did for black people.
Exactly.
And it's easier to make these arguments than it is to just sit and listen to pain and to really try as much as I possibly can to empathize with pain and with, reconcile myself with privilege and the privilege I've been privy to my whole life that, I didn't do anything to deserve. But yeah, I mean, I grew up relatively poor, but I was still privileged just because of the color of my skin.
Well, and also that you're tall.
And I'm tall and I'm straight. You know what I mean? I've got every card in the deck is mine, man. A comedian I heard once said, if you got to the end of the life and you started over and had to re-up, I'd re-up for this every time. You know what I mean?
I tell people all the time, I'm coming back as a tall white man. No doubt about it.
It's the best.
I'm not coming back as a short white man.
Are you a Dave Chappelle fan? You see his Netflix
I haven't seen
comedy
it yet.
specials? So in one of them, he talks about the Me Too moment.
Yeah.
And he talks about how feminists in society right now should warm up to the idea of having flawed allies, men in particular that have had indiscretions in the past and want to be on the side of justice now. He referred to Ben Affleck as an example. He said, Ben Affleck came out and said he wants to support the movement, #MeToo. And then he said, you touched the breast in 1995, and then he's out, but his point was, he said, you're fighting fire with fire in a sense. And what you should be doing, he's talking to the Me Too movement, what you should be doing is looking at South Africa.
Yeah.
And Mandela and Tutu and those guys who understood something that is totally lost on us today. He said, what they understood is that the people who benefit from a system of oppression and injustice are not villains.
Right.
They are victims.
Yeah.
They are victims too. And so instead of being punitive, they just let people tell their stories about privilege and abuse and these things that we see. A week ago, a prominent white Christians, evangelicals who preach Jesus all the time, and who pushed for, one president's ouster in the 90s because of moral indiscretions. And now we've got a president who's paying off porn stars, and they're giving him a pass because of his policies. A mulligan, they said. He was only 70 when he did this, and so he's still learning. You know what I mean? He's still growing. And so what do you do with all of this in your position, in your place as a leader, as a black man, as a Christian? What tact do you take with white evangelicals like me, for example, who are often so slow to listen?
The absolute powerlessness that I feel currently breaks my heart. And I feel powerless because I've been waiting on the people in power on the white side of Christendom to say something. And my wife will tell you, man, I say it all the time. I'm saying, why is it so quiet? I mean, why isn't anybody who has the voice saying something about this? Because I heard crap all the time when Obama was president. Why isn't he doing this? Why isn't he doing this? But this is what I know as a black man. If Obama had done any one of the last 90 things our current president has perpetrated, he would have been incarcerated. not put out of office, disgraced, perp walk across America from one end to the other. So the church is quiet. The church has a price to pay for, silence. When this story is told, part of the glaring truth is going to be, and the church said nothing.
Is it harder than it's ever been to be black and Christian? And
Oh, yeah.
pastor?
Yeah,
That's saying a lot, considering you grew up drinking from a colored water fountain.
yeah. Harder than it's ever been. Makes me cry. I probably have never been more challenged to be black and Christian as I am right now. What keeps me coming back is hope, which is what Jesus represents for me. At the end of the day, I believe Jesus looked more like me than he did my white counterpart. At the end of the day, I believe Jesus messed with an economy and got executed as a result of it. You mess with somebody's money. You mess with systems of power's money, and you will get executed. That's what happened to Dr. King. He didn't get executed when he was talking about equal rights for sanitation workers. He got executed when he started talking about equalities in economies.
What hope do you have for that changing in America?
It's the reason I show up for church every week. I get to talk to this little small microcosm in this big world about the power of love in the midst of hatred and hostility. There's one thing that I remember Dr. King. I actually got to see him before he died here in Houston. He came to speak at the Coliseum. My dad took me, and there was a bomb threat that night. And I remember running through the halls of the Coliseum, wondering why all the adults were so terrified, because it really felt like a fun run for me. And I ultimately realized that, wow, so they want to kill this guy, because he's talking about racial justice. I think at the end of the day, I have the same hopes that Dr. King espoused, the hopes that love is stronger than hate, the hopes that one day your kids and my grandkids will be able to sit at the same table without either one of them espousing privilege just based on the color of their skin.
You still believe, like you did, that the moral arc of the universe bends toward justice?
I still believe that. It's the only thing that keeps me coming back, man. If I didn't believe that the moral arc of the universe bent towards justice, I would be atheist.
You ever feel like that kid sitting in the church pew, mad at the church, mad at God, really? Like, why can't God do something about this now?
I'm going to tell you, Eric, I talk all over the country and parts of the world. And I always start my talk with a picture of the 8-year-old Rudy. I put that picture up on the screen. I say, regardless to who you see before you right now, the guy talking to you is that kid.
I still see him.
Yeah, that 8-year-old Rudy who still wonders why. Ain't shit changed. Not really. Water fountain's gone. I get out of these streets today, I still feel the same fear every time a police car pulls up behind me. Every time I walk in a store, I still feel like they're watching me. I'm 61, man. Shit ain't changed.
I don't think I've ever been watched in a store.
You've never been watched in a store.
They watch me to see what I'm going to buy.
That's right.
What was your response whenever, I'm sure you must have heard white Christians or white people just saying, hey, we matter too, all lives matter and that kind of thing. Like, What did you hear in that retort?
Well, first of all, my response was there was never any question as to whether or not you mattered. Every time I wake up, there's a question as to whether or not I matter. And even though I've been able to acquire a little more stuff, a little more notoriety, a little more influence, at the end of the day, I'm still a black man.
Tonight, I am extending an open hand to work with members of both parties, Democrats and Republicans, to protect our citizens of every background, color, religion, and creed. My duty and the sacred duty of every elected official in this chamber is to defend Americans, to protect their safety, their families, their communities, and their right to the American dream. Because Americans are dreamers too.
Did you listen to his speech last week?
Well, I could only listen so much.
Yeah. So
I had to keep one of those bags they keep at the in the plane seat in front of you.
Barf bags. I listened to it out of just sheer curiosity because I know the people he's talking to.
Yeah.
My people are the people he's talking to. Not necessarily my people today.
Yeah.
People I grew up with. I grew up in Northeast Texas,
That's right.
out in the sticks, and it's pro-Trump through and through. And he is masterful.
Man,
Masterful.
The dude is
at the rhetoric.
That's right.
And just what gets the people I grew up with riled up in support of him. We Americans are dreamers too. In response to the DREAM Act and things like that was a brilliant stroke. And it actually reminded me of All Lives Matter, because that was to say we matter too. And those kinds of things really resonate with his core audience, because there is this fear of being surpassed or usurped or forgotten somehow. Whether or not it's based in something legitimate, it's a real fear.
Exactly.
And so it's there, and it must be dealt with. I just don't know what to do. And it's probably the most white guy thing I can say, but
it's not really anything you can do.
What
man.
can be done? How can I fix this, Rudy?
I tell you what you can do. You have quite a few people you stand in front of, and your constituency is an affluent, in many cases, powerful constituency. Now, the risk to your well-being, to your standard of living, would be exacted if you stood in front of that group and said, "Yo, we need to do something about this."
Mm.
But at the end of the day, that's what you can do. I think if you don't say something, Eric, you're complicit with all of the other white folk who basically know there's a problem, but are afraid to say something about it because of the personal toll that it exact on your well-being.
I'm convicted. I'm convicted about that. I mean, I had a running tally in my head as this interview went on, how many listeners I'm losing just by having the conversation.
Well, yeah, man. I tell you, I think things are growing at the story for a reason. And that's because people see something in you and your wife. They see the same thing that I saw when I first met you. And I saw a guy who was at least aware. But not only aware, you're awake.
Mm.
And people really need awake.
Mm.
They really do.
Man, it's hard.
Oh, yeah.
To stay awake in the loop.
It's hard to stay awake. Yeah, man, because I'm going to tell you, Eric, you and I both know you can doze off and you can be perfectly fine for the next 20 years. I will tell you this, though. This is a moment of prophecy here. You won't have the luxury of dozing off because you have ethnic minority kids.
Mm-hmm. Yeah.
And if you doze off, you're dozing off on your children and your grandchildren because they don't live in the same world that you grew up in.
That's right.
Yeah. They are going to be marginalized unless something is done. And you have a responsibility to do it.
Rudy's right. My wife, Giovanna, is from Ecuador. But most people assume she's Mexican. Both of our kids look Hispanic. And I do wonder what kinds of jokes or snide remarks they'll be subjected to as they grow up. And if you think that stuff doesn't happen anymore, think again. Last August, my wife and kids were having lunch at Chick-fil-A when a white woman in her 60s told my children to leave the playground. When my wife asked why she'd done that, she pointed her finger in her face and said, "Oh, why don't you go back to where you came from?" Now, I know stuff like this is uncomfortable to listen to. In fact, if you're white and you're still listening, I applaud you. Because while listening to this stuff can be hard, sometimes it's the most important thing we can do. Now, I know a lot of people are uncomfortable with the Black Lives Matter movement and things like that, but discomfort should make us listen more, not less. People of color are hurting in America. They've been hurting for a long time, hurting in ways I've never had to hurt. I've had struggles. I've been poor. I've been uninsured. I used to have really bad credit. But as Rudy said, I've never been followed around in a store. My teachers never expected less of me because of my skin color. I've always gone into job interviews expecting to get the job. Whenever I've gotten pulled over, I expected to get a warning. And most importantly, the fact that my life matters, that white lives matter, has never been in doubt. So, what lives matter? All lives, of course. When you hear someone say, Black lives matter, don't hear them saying, white lives don't. Listen more closely, and what you'll really hear is people asking, do Black lives matter? Do we matter? What you'll really hear is 8-year-old Rudy sitting on his church pew wondering, do I matter to you? Like Rudy, I still hold out hope that the moral arc of the universe bends toward justice. And I believe I was created to help it bend. And I believe you were too. So I want to thank Rudy and all those who speak up and speak out, even when it's inconvenient or costly to do so. Thank you. And thank all of you for listening. We're going to take a little break next week as we plan the second half of our first season. But we're going to be back in 2 weeks with episode 6 of Maybe God.
Remember those walls I built? Well, baby, they're tumbling down. And they didn't even put up a fight. They didn't even make the sound. I found a way to let you in, but I never really had a doubt. Standing in the light of your halo, I got my angel now. Everywhere I'm looking now, I'm surrounded by your embrace. Baby, I can see your halo. You know you're my saving grace. You're everything I need and more. It's written all over your face. Baby, I can feel your halo. Pray it won't fade away. Halo, you see your halo. Halo, your halo. Halo, you see your halo. Halo.
Maybe God is produced by Eric Huffman, Brandon Duke, and me, Julie Merle-Courtois. Our sound engineer is Pat Lowry, our editor is Brittany Holland, and music is by Nathan Bonus. If you have questions or doubts you'd like us to address in upcoming episodes of Maybe God, email us at maybegodpod@gmail.com or start a discussion with us on our Facebook page, Maybe God Podcast. And don't forget to subscribe today on Apple Podcast or your favorite podcast app.